The scout ship Velkaru's Hand moved slowly through the dark, empty space between two dying stars. This part of the galaxy had no name that mattered to anyone. It was just a gap, a stretch of nothing between older, more important systems. Ships did not usually come here. But the crew of the Velkaru's Hand were not usual ships. They were scavengers, hunters of old wrecks, sellers of broken metal and forgotten technology, and their sensors had just found something big. Captain Threll Osu sat in the middle of the small bridge, his 4 eyes fixed on the main screen. He was a Doskani, a species covered in thin gray scales, with long fingers built for careful work. His people were not warriors, they were traders, builders, and, when the chance came, thieves of dead things. War was not their way. Profit was. "Report," Threll said, his voice low and calm. The navigator, a young Doskani named Pell, leaned closer to her console. "Captain, we have a large metal object ahead. No power readings, no heat, no movement. It has been drifting here for a long time, I think. The surface is old, damaged. Life signs? None detected." Threll's 4 eyes blinked in a slow wave, one after another. That was a good sign. A dead ship, with no crew and no defenses, was the best kind of treasure. No danger, no fighting, just profit. "Bring us closer," he said, slowly. "I want a full scan before we get near." The ship crept forward, its old engines humming quietly. On the screen, the object grew larger and larger, until its true shape became clear. It was not just a wreck, it was massive. Longer than 3 of their own ships put end to end. Its hull was gray and black, covered in strange markings that none of the crew recognized. Long weapon barrels lined its sides like the ribs of some sleeping beast. Twisted metal hung from one side, torn away by some old battle. The front of the ship was shaped like a blade, sharp and cruel, built by minds that understood violence. "By the old stars," whispered Pell. "What is that?" Threll did not answer right away. He was staring at the shape of it, at the way it seemed to promise danger, even while sitting dead and silent in space. He had seen many wrecks in his years of scavenging. Old mining ships, broken cargo haulers, even a few military vessels from smaller wars between minor species, but he had never seen anything built like this. "Scan its markings," he finally said. "Find out what species built it." The ship's computer took a moment to search through its old records. Then a single word appeared on the screen, glowing in red letters. "Human." The bridge went quiet. Even the soft hum of the engines seemed to fade into the background. "Human," Pell repeated slowly, as if tasting the word. "I have heard that name. My grandmother used to tell stories." "Everyone has heard stories," said Threll. His voice was steady, but something in his chest had gone tight and cold. "Most of them are probably lies, exaggerations. Nobody has actually seen a human ship in." "How long has it been since the war ended?" 43 years, said Doran, the ship's engineer, speaking up from his station at the back of the bridge. Doran was older than the rest of the crew, with scars along his arms, from a life spent working with dangerous machines. 43 years since the humans and the Coalition signed the peace agreement. 43 years since anyone from the Coalition worlds has seen a human warship up close. "And now here is one," said Threll, "dead and floating in the middle of nowhere." He thought about it for a long moment. The human Coalition war had ended before Threll was even born, but its shadow still stretched across every part of Coalition space. The Doskani, along with a dozen other species, had banded together under the banner of the Coalition to fight against a species that none of them fully understood. The humans had come from a single small world, a world so unimportant that at first the Coalition scouts had barely noticed it. But when the Coalition tried to expand into human space, thinking it would be an easy conquest, they had learned a terrible lesson. Humans did not fight like other species. They did not retreat when the odds turned against them. They did not surrender when their numbers ran low. They built weapons that should not have worked, using materials that should not have held together, and somehow those weapons worked anyway. Entire Coalition fleets, filled with proud old species who had been flying between stars for centuries, were destroyed by human ships built in a fraction of the time. The war had lasted 11 years. By the end of it, both sides were exhausted, and a peace was signed. Human territory was small compared to the vast reaches of Coalition space, but nobody in the Coalition wanted to test human resolve again. An uneasy quiet had settled over the border between human and coalition space ever since. Trade was rare. Contact was rarer. Most coalition citizens had never even seen a human in person. And now, drifting here in the empty dark, was one of their warships. "This could be worth a fortune," said Doran, breaking the silence. "If the weapon systems are intact, even broken ones, the black markets would pay enormous sums for human military technology. Everyone wants to know how they build their ships. Everyone wants to copy their weapons." Threll nodded slowly. He knew Doran was right. Human technology was famous across coalition space, not because it was more advanced in the usual sense, but because it was strange. Efficient in ways that did not match coalition engineering philosophy, aggressive in design, built to solve problems with force rather than elegance. A single intact human weapon system could fund the Velkaru's hand and its crew for the rest of their lives. But there was also the tight, cold feeling in Threll's chest that would not go away. "Doran," he said, "run every scan you have. I want to know if that ship is truly dead. I do not want any surprises." "Already running them, Captain," Doran said. His hands moved quickly over his console. Minutes passed in silence as the scans completed, layer after layer of information filling the screens around the bridge. "No power core signature," Doran reported. "No active reactor. No heat bloom anywhere on the hull. Life support is completely offline. There is no sign of any active system on that ship, Captain. It has been dead for a long time. My guess is years, maybe even decades." "And crew?" "No life signs. None at all. If there was ever a crew aboard, they are gone now. Dead, or they escaped before we got here. Either way, that ship is empty." Threll felt some of the tightness in his chest ease. An empty, dead ship was exactly what they had hoped to find when they set out on this scavenging run. No danger. No fighting. Just salvage. "Bring us alongside it," he said. "We will send a boarding team. I want a full survey of the ship before we decide what to take. Doran, you will lead the team. Pell, you stay on the bridge and keep the engines ready. If anything, and I mean anything, looks wrong, we leave immediately. Understood?" "Understood, Captain," said Pell. Doran was already standing, pulling on his environment suit, a look of excitement in his old eyes. "It has been a long time since I got to explore something this interesting," he said. "A real human warship. My father fought in the war, you know. He always said the humans were like ghosts. You never saw them coming, until it was too late. Let us hope this one stays quiet," said Threll, standing as well. "I am coming with you." "Captain, is that wise?" asked Pell. "If something goes wrong." "If something goes wrong, I want to be there to make the decision myself," Threll said. "Besides, I want to see this ship with my own eyes." The Velkaru's hand drew closer to the massive derelict, its small size making the human warship look even larger by comparison. Up close, the damage to the hull was even more obvious. Long scars ran across the metal, the kind left by weapon fire. Whole sections of the outer plating were torn away, revealing dark, twisted machinery beneath. And yet, despite all the damage, the ship still held together. It still looked, somehow, dangerous, like a predator that was only sleeping, not dead. Threll tried to shake the feeling away as he pulled on his own suit. It was just a ship, a machine. Machines could not feel anything, could not wait, could not be dangerous, unless something was actively powering them. And Doran's scans had been clear. No power, no life, nothing but cold, dead metal. The boarding team gathered at the airlock. Besides Threll and Doran, there were two other crew members. Sask, a quiet, strong-armed Doskani who handled most of the heavy lifting work on salvage runs, and Mira, the youngest of the crew, barely out of training, who had begged to come along when she heard the word human. "Stay close to me," Threll told her. "This is not a simple salvage job. This is a human ship. We show it respect, and we are careful. Understood?" "Understood, Captain," Mira said, though her voice shook slightly with excitement. The airlock cycled, and the small shuttle detached from the Velkaru's hand, drifting slowly across the gap of space toward the massive human wreck. As they approached, the size of the ship became almost overwhelming. What had looked large from a distance now filled the entire view outside the shuttle's windows. Threll could see individual weapon ports up close now. Huge barrels built for firing something far more powerful than anything the Doskani had ever built. He could see the torn edges of the hull, where entire sections had been ripped away in some old battle, the metal twisted like paper. "There," Doran said, pointing toward a section of the hull. "That looks like an emergency airlock. If we can get it open, we can get inside without cutting through the hull." The shuttle drew alongside the massive ship, matching its slow, silent drift through space. Sask worked quickly, attaching a docking clamp to the airlock, sealing the connection between the shuttle and the derelict. For a long moment, nobody moved. They all just stared at the airlock door, an old, scarred piece of metal that had not opened in who knew how many years. "Well," said Threll, taking a slow breath. "Let us see what secrets this ship has been keeping." Doran worked the manual controls on the airlock, forcing the old mechanism to turn. It took effort, the metal groaning in protest, but slowly, the door began to open. Stale, freezing air rushed out into the vacuum, quickly disappearing into nothing. Beyond the door was only darkness. One by one, the boarding team switched on their suit lights and stepped through the airlock, into the belly of the human warship. The inside of the ship was cold, colder than anything Threll had ever felt, even through his suit's heating systems. The corridors were narrow compared to Doskani's ship design, built for a species that Threll now realized must have been smaller and more compact than his own people. The walls were lined with strange symbols, human writing, unreadable to any of them. Wires and cables hung loose from broken panels, drifting slightly in the absence of gravity. "This place is a maze," Mira whispered, her voice carrying an edge of nervousness now that the excitement had faded into the reality of standing inside a dead human warship. "Stay together," Threll said again. "Doran, which way to the main systems?" Doran checked a small device in his hand, one that could read the layout of ship corridors based on standard warship design. If human ships are built anything like ours, the main command areas should be toward the center of the ship, and the engine and weapon control systems should be below us, near the ship's spine. "Let us start with the bridge. If there is any information to be found about what happened here, it will be there." They moved through the dark corridors slowly, their suit lights cutting narrow beams through the blackness. Every few steps, they passed something that told a story without words. A helmet, cracked and empty, floating gently against a wall. Scorch marks along the ceiling, the signs of some fire long since starved of oxygen and died out. A closed door, with deep claw-like scratches across its surface, as if something had tried desperately to force it open. "What do you think happened here?" Mira asked quietly. "I do not know," Threll admitted, "but whatever it was, it must have been terrible." They reached a large set of double doors, thicker and more heavily built than anything else they had seen so far. Doran ran his scanner over the surface. "This should be the bridge," he said. "The controls are dead, like everything else on this ship. We will have to force it open manually." Sask stepped forward, using a heavy tool to pry at the edge of the doors. It took several minutes of effort, the metal groaning and screeching in protest, but eventually, the doors slid open just wide enough for them to squeeze through, one at a time. The bridge of the human warship was larger than Threll had expected, filled with rows of dark control panels and screens, all of them dead and silent. In the center of the room sat a single large chair, facing what must have been the main view screen, though it too was dark now. "Captain," Doran said suddenly, his voice tight. "Over here." Threll moved to where Doran was standing, near one of the side control panels. There, resting against the base of the panel, was something that made his stomach turn cold. A skeleton. Human, judging by its shape, though smaller and more delicate than Threll had imagined humans to be. The bones were clean, picked clean by time and the vacuum, dressed in the remains of a torn uniform. Nobody spoke for a long moment. "There is your answer," Threll finally said quietly. "At least part of it. Someone was here when this ship died, and they did not get out." Mira had gone very still, staring at the skeleton with wide eyes. Even Sask, usually silent and unbothered by anything, seemed to be holding his breath. "Let us find out what happened," Threll said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Doran, see if you can access any of the ship's memory banks. Even without power, some data storage systems can be read manually. I want to know what destroyed this ship, and I want to know it before we take a single piece of salvage." Doran nodded and moved toward one of the control panels near the captain's chair, already pulling tools from his belt to begin the delicate work of extracting data from a dead machine. As he worked, Threll found himself looking back at the skeleton, at the torn uniform, at the small details that made this dead thing feel less like a wreck and more like the site of something tragic. He did not know it yet, but this ship had not finished telling its story. Not even close. Somewhere deep within its cold, silent hull, something was still there, waiting, patient, beyond anything Threll could imagine, and it was only a matter of time before it woke up. "Captain," Doran said suddenly, his voice sharp with surprise, "I found something. There is a data core here that still has a tiny amount of power. A backup system, maybe. It is not much, but it might be enough to pull some records." "Do it," Threll said, carefully. As Doran worked, none of them noticed the faintest change in the air around them. A whisper of sound, so quiet it could have been imagination, deep in the ship's core, far below the bridge, something that had been sleeping for a very long time, had just felt the presence of intruders for the first time. And it was beginning, slowly, to wake up. Doran worked carefully at the small data core, his tools glowing faintly in the dark bridge. The rest of the boarding team stood around him in silence, their suit lights making small pools of brightness in the endless black of the dead ship. Threll kept glancing at the skeleton near the control panel, unable to fully look away from it. "Got something," Doran said after several minutes. "The core is old, and most of the data is corrupted, but there are fragments here. Ship's logs. I can try to piece some of it together." "Do it," Threll said, slowly. "I want to understand what happened on this ship." Doran connected a small reader to the exposed wiring of the data core, and after a moment, faint text began to scroll across the tiny screen of his device. He read aloud, translating the strange human words as best he could, with the help of the device's built-in language database, one built from decades-old records of the war. "Ship designation. UES Meridian's Vow," Doran read. UES. That must stand for something like United Earthship, based on old war records. This was a coalition classification we captured from a few human transmissions long ago. "A warship of a human nation," Threll murmured. "Go on." Doran continued reading, piecing together broken fragments of the log. "Most of this is corrupted, Captain, but I am getting something about a system called Kello's Drift, and something about an evacuation, a civilian evacuation." Mira leaned closer. "Evacuation? Was there a battle here?" "I do not know yet," Doran said. "Give me a moment." The rest of them waited in silence as Doran worked, the only sound the soft hum of their suits and the faint clicking of his tools. Finally, more text appeared, and Doran's voice grew slower, more careful, as he read. "This is dated during the final year of the war. It says the Meridian's Vow was assigned to protect a civilian convoy fleeing a coalition attack on a colony called Kello's Drift. The convoy included evacuation ships carrying families, children, non-combatants." Threll felt his chest tighten again. He remembered stories from his own history classes about the war, filtered through coalition perspective, always painting the humans as the aggressors, the dangerous unknown that had to be stopped. He had never once heard a story about human children being evacuated from a burning colony. "The log says the convoy was ambushed," Doran continued, his voice quieter now. "A larger coalition fleet found them before they could escape. The Meridian's Vow was the only warship protecting 12 unarmed transport vessels." 12 civilian ships against a fleet, Sask said, speaking for the first time since they had boarded. His deep voice carried a weight that had not been there before. "That does not sound like good odds." "It was not," Doran said. "The log entry says the coalition fleet included 6 warships. 6 against 1. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Threll tried to imagine it. A single ship, alone, standing between an overwhelming enemy force and a group of defenseless civilians. He had grown up hearing about the terrifying power of human ships, about how dangerous and unpredictable they were in battle. But he had never once thought about what it might have looked like from the other side, what it might have felt like to be a human captain, facing down impossible odds, with nothing but a duty to protect people who could not protect themselves. "What happened?" Mira asked quietly. Doran's tools clicked as he tried to pull more information from the failing data core. "The log becomes fragmented here. There are gaps. But I can see the Meridian's Vow held position between the convoy and the attacking fleet. It says here, all transports must reach the jump point, hold the line. That is repeated several times. I think it might have been an order, given again and again. Hold the line, Threll repeated softly. There is more, Doran said. The ship took heavy damage. Multiple hull breaches. Loss of primary power. Loss of most of the crew, it seems. But the log continues for a while longer. The convoy made it to the jump point. All 12 transports escaped. And the warship? Threll asked, though some part of him already suspected the answer. Doran was quiet for a moment before he answered. The last clear entry says the Meridian's vow remained behind to cover the convoy's retreat, drawing the attacking fleet's fire until the transports were safely away. After that, the log becomes too corrupted to read clearly. But based on the state of this ship and what we found on the bridge, he glanced toward the skeleton. I think we can guess what happened next. Threll looked around the dark bridge with new eyes. He was no longer standing in the wreck of some dangerous alien war machine. He was standing in the tomb of a crew who had chosen to die so that a group of strangers, families with children, could live. It did not matter that they were human, and he was Doskani, and their two species had once been locked in a brutal war. In this moment, standing in the cold and the dark, Threll felt something he had not expected to feel at all. Respect. There is a name here, Doran said suddenly, his voice softer than before. The captain's name. Captain Elena Voss. It looks like this was her chair we are standing near. Mira looked down at the skeleton again, and this time, her eyes were not filled with nervous excitement, but something closer to sadness. She stayed until the end, Mira said quietly. Even when everyone else was gone, or dying, she stayed at her post. That is what the logs suggest, Doran said. Threll took a slow breath, forcing himself to focus. Sentiment was one thing, but they still had a job to do, and a discovery this significant needed to be handled carefully. Doran, can you pull the rest of the crew manifest? I want to know how many people were aboard when this ship was lost. Doran worked for another few minutes before shaking his head. The manifest data is too damaged. I can tell you the ship was designed to carry a crew of around 400, based on the layout and standard human warship classifications from the war era. But how many were actually aboard during this battle? Or how many survived long enough to escape? I cannot say. Escape? Sask asked. You think some of the crew got away? It is possible, Doran said. There were escape pods along the lower hull, based on the ship's layout. Several of them appear to be missing from their launch bays, according to what I can still read from the ship's systems. That could mean they were used before the ship was disabled, or it could mean they were destroyed along with everything else. Threll turned that thought over in his mind. If some of the crew had escaped, they might still be out there somewhere, or they might have been picked up decades ago by other ships and returned home to human space. It did not matter much now, for their purposes here. What mattered was that a coalition fleet, in the final desperate year of a terrible war, had ambushed a convoy of unarmed civilians, and it had taken a single human warship giving everything it had to save them. Captain, Mira said suddenly, glancing toward the doorway they had entered through. Did you hear that? Everyone went still, listening. For a moment, there was nothing but the soft hum of their suits. I do not hear anything, Threll said. I thought I heard a click, like something powering on, far away. Doran checked his scanner quickly. No new power readings, Captain. The ship is still dead. It was probably just settling metal. Old wrecks make strange noises sometimes, especially when a boarding team disturbs the internal pressure balance. Mira did not look fully convinced, but she nodded, and the moment passed. Threll made a mental note to keep his own senses sharp, just in case, but he did not want to alarm the crew further, without cause. They had a mission to complete. Let us continue, Threll said. Doran, is there any more you can pull from this data core? A little, Doran said. There is a final entry, very short, and mostly corrupted. I can make out a few words. Something like, if anyone finds this ship, tell them we held. The words hung in the cold, dark air of the bridge for a long moment. Nobody spoke. Even Sask, who rarely showed much emotion, seemed to be affected by the weight of what they had just learned. They held, Threll finally said quietly. The convoy made it. That message was answered, even if the ones who wrote it never knew it. He looked around the bridge one more time, at the dead control panels, the drifting cables, the empty chair, where a captain named Elena Voss had once given the order to hold the line against impossible odds. Then he turned to his crew. "We are not stripping this ship for parts," he said firmly. "Not the bridge, at least, not this room. Whatever else we take from the lower decks, this place stays as it is. It deserves that much respect." "Agreed," said Doran, and Sask nodded as well. "What about the rest of the ship?" Mira asked. "The weapons, the engines. This is still worth a fortune, Captain. We came out here for salvage." Threll considered this for a long moment. Part of him, the practical trader part that had run this crew for years, knew that Mira was right. The value of even a fraction of this ship's technology could set them all up comfortably for the rest of their lives. But another part of him, the part that had just learned the story of what happened on this ship, felt uneasy about picking apart the remains of something that had died protecting innocent lives. "We will survey the rest of the ship," he decided finally, "but carefully, and with respect. If there is technology we can salvage without disturbing this," he gestured toward the skeleton and the captain's chair, "then we will consider it. But the bridge and anything connected to the crew quarters stays untouched." "Understood?" "Understood, Captain," the others said together. They began to move toward the exit, ready to continue their survey of the lower decks, when Doran suddenly stopped, staring at his scanner with a confused expression. "Captain," he said slowly, "I am picking up something strange." "What is it?" "A power reading. Small, but it was not there a moment ago. It is coming from deep in the ship, below us, near what I would guess is the main reactor core." Threll felt the cold feeling return to his chest. "I thought you said the ship had no active power." "It did not," Doran said, his voice tightening with confusion and the first edge of concern. "It should not. Every system I scanned was completely dead. But this reading, it is small, but it is definitely there now, and it is growing." "Could it be some kind of automatic system?" Mira asked. "Like an emergency beacon, or something like that?" "Maybe," Doran said, though he did not sound convinced. Human ships from the war era did sometimes carry deep emergency systems, backups designed to survive massive damage. It is possible we triggered something just by being aboard. Pulling data from that core might have sent some kind of signal through the ship's remaining systems. Threll's mind raced through the possibilities. An automatic distress beacon would not be dangerous. Just an old signal broadcasting into empty space, probably unheard by anyone after all these years. But if it was something else, something more active, how long until we know what it is? He asked. "I am not sure," Doran admitted. "The reading is faint, but it is definitely growing stronger. Whatever it is waking up." "Sask, Mira, begin moving back toward the airlock," Threll ordered, his voice firm and calm despite the growing unease in his chest. "Doran, keep monitoring that power signature. I want constant updates." "Captain, are we abandoning the survey?" Mira asked, though she was already moving to follow the order. "We are being cautious," Threll said. "There is a difference. If this is nothing, an old beacon or a dying backup system, we can always come back and finish the survey later. If it is something else..." He did not finish the sentence, but nobody needed him to. They moved back through the dark corridors of the ship, retracing the path they had taken to reach the bridge. The narrow hallways felt different now, less like a quiet tomb and more like something that was, impossibly, beginning to stir. Threll found himself glancing over his shoulder more than once, though there was nothing to see except darkness beyond the reach of their suit lights. "Captain," Doran said as they walked, his voice tight with concentration as he watched his scanner. "The power reading has spread. It is not just in the reactor core anymore. I am picking up faint energy signatures throughout multiple systems now. Weapons control, life support, even some sections of the hull itself." "That does not sound like an emergency beacon," Sask said grimly. "No," Doran agreed. "It does not." They picked up their pace, moving faster through the dark corridors, the beams of their suit lights bouncing off the scarred metal walls. Threll's mind was working quickly now, trying to think through every possibility, every plan, every option they might need if this situation turned dangerous. "Doran, can that ship actually become operational again, after all these years, with this much damage?" "I do not know, Captain," Doran admitted. Human engineering during the war was famous for being resilient in ways that did not always make sense to our own scientists. If any species could build a ship capable of surviving decades of dormancy and then reactivating, it would be them. But I never imagined we would actually see it happen. They reached the airlock at last, and Sask began working quickly to reopen the door, his hands moving with practiced speed despite the growing tension in the group. As the door slid open, revealing the small shuttle waiting beyond, Threll allowed himself a small breath of relief. "Everyone aboard the shuttle, now," he ordered. "Doran, keep that scanner running. I want to know the moment anything changes." They filed quickly through the airlock and into the waiting shuttle, Sask sealing the connection behind them as soon as the last of the crew was aboard. Threll settled into his seat, watching through the small viewport as the massive, scarred hull of the human warship drifted silently outside. "Status?" he asked. Doran checked his scanner one more time before looking up, his expression grim. "Power levels are still rising, Captain. Whatever woke up on that ship, it is not finished waking up yet." Outside the shuttle, deep within the cold, dark hull of the Meridian's Vow, systems that had been silent for decades were beginning to hum with life once again. Lights that had not glowed in years flickered weakly in empty corridors. And somewhere in the heart of the ship, an old and patient intelligence, built for exactly this kind of moment, was beginning to understand that intruders had boarded its hull. It had one directive left, buried deep in its programming, unchanged since the day its crew had given their lives to protect the innocent. Defend the ship, defend what remains, and if the ship is threatened, do whatever is necessary. The weapons of the Meridian's Vow, silent for decades, were beginning, one by one, to come online. The shuttle detached from the human warship and pulled back toward the Velkaru's hand, moving as fast as its small engines could manage. Inside, the boarding team sat in tense silence, watching the massive hull of the Meridian's Vow shrink slowly behind them through the rear viewport. "Talk to me, Doran," Threll said, gripping the edge of his seat. "Power levels continue to rise," Doran reported, his eyes fixed on his scanner. "I am now reading active systems across nearly a third of the ship. Life support is coming back online in several sections. And Captain, weapons control just activated." Threll's stomach dropped. "How long until those weapons are actually operational?" "I do not know," Doran admitted. "This is old human technology, and none of us have ever seen it wake up from full dormancy before. But based on the speed of the last few minutes, I would guess, not long." "Pell," Threll said into his comm, hailing the Velkaru's hand. "Status report. Are you seeing this?" Pell's voice came back immediately, tight with worry. "Captain, I am reading massive power spikes from the derelict. It is definitely not dead anymore. Should I prep the engines for immediate departure?" "Do it," Threll said. "We are almost back aboard. The moment we dock, I want us moving away from that ship as fast as possible." "Understood, Captain." The shuttle closed the remaining distance to the Velkaru's hand quickly, sliding into the docking bay with practiced precision, despite the tension in the air. The moment the shuttle was secure, Threll was out of his seat and moving toward the bridge, the rest of the boarding team close behind him. "Report," he said, as he stepped onto the bridge, still pulling off pieces of his environment suit. "Captain, the human ship is definitely waking up," Pell said, her 4 eyes wide with alarm as she stared at her console. "Power readings across nearly the entire vessel now. And I am seeing something else. The ship's outer hull is moving. Panels are shifting. I think weapon systems are beginning to physically extend from the hull." "Get us away from it," Threll ordered. "Full reverse thrust, now." "Aye, Captain." The Velkaru's hand began to pull back from the massive derelict, its engines straining as it tried to put distance between itself and the awakening warship. On the main screen, the crew watched as the human ship, once so dark and silent, began to change before their eyes. Lights flickered on along its scarred hull, faint at first, then growing steadily brighter. Sections of armor plating shifted and rotated, revealing weapon systems that had been hidden and protected during the ship's long sleep. "By the old stars," Mira whispered, staring at the screen. "It is really happening. It is coming back to life." "Doran, can you tell if it has detected us?" Threll asked. Doran worked quickly at a secondary console, pulling data from every sensor the Velkaru's hand had available. "I am not certain, Captain." But given that we just spent the last hour aboard that ship, pulling data from its systems, I would assume it knows we are here. Threll's mind raced. If the ship's automated defenses considered them a threat, they could be in serious danger. A single human warship from the war era, even one damaged and alone, had been known to fight off entire small fleets. The Velkaru's Hand was a scavenger vessel, built for hauling salvage, not for combat. It had almost no weapons of its own, and certainly nothing that could stand against a ship built to survive a war against the entire coalition. "Pell, how long until we are at a safe distance?" he asked. "At our current speed, several minutes at least, Captain. We are not exactly built for fast escapes. Increase speed as much as you safely can." "Aye, Captain, though I want to note, if that ship decides to fire on us, distance may not save us. Human weapons from the war were known to have extremely long effective ranges." Threll knew this too, but there was little else they could do except try. He watched the main screen, his 4 eyes tracking every change in the human warship's appearance. More and more weapon systems were extending from the hull now. Long barrels that must have been designed to fire something far more powerful than anything the Velkaru's Hand could withstand. "Captain," Doran said suddenly, his voice tight, "I am picking up something new. It looks like a targeting scan. The ship is actively scanning us." "It sees us," Threll said quietly. For a long, tense moment, nobody on the bridge said anything. They simply watched the screen, waiting to see what would happen next. Would the ancient warship open fire on them, mistaking them for enemies from a war that had ended decades ago? Would its automated systems recognize that the war was over, that the coalition and human space had been at peace for over 40 years? Or did it even know that the war had ended at all? "Captain, the scan has stopped," Doran reported after a moment, some of the tension in his voice easing slightly. "I am not detecting any weapons lock. It scanned us, but it does not appear to be preparing to fire." "Keep monitoring," Threll said, though he allowed himself the smallest breath of relief. It might just be gathering information before it decides what to do. "There is something else, Captain," Doran added, his brow furrowing as he studied his readings more closely. "I am picking up a transmission. Very weak, very old in coding, but it is definitely coming from the human ship." "A transmission? Put it through, if you can." Doran worked quickly, running the signal through every translation protocol the ship's computer had available. It took several attempts before something coherent began to emerge. A voice, mechanical and slightly distorted from decades of disuse, speaking in a language that the ship's systems slowly began to translate. "Unidentified vessel. This is UES Meridian's Vow. Automated Defense Protocol. Engaged." The voice cut in and out, fragments of words lost to static and time. "State your designation and intent." "It is asking who we are," Mira said, wide-eyed. "It wants to know if we are a threat," Threll said, his mind working quickly. "Doran, can we respond? Can we send a message back?" "I believe so, Captain, though I do not know if its systems will understand our language any better than we understand its own. Try anyway. Tell it we are not hostile. Tell it we are scavengers, not soldiers. Tell it the war between our people and the humans ended decades ago." Doran worked quickly, composing a message and running it through the ship's translation systems before transmitting it toward the human warship. They waited, watching the screen, watching the weapon systems that were still extending slowly from the ship's scarred hull. For a long moment, there was no response. Then the mechanical voice returned, still fragmented, still distorted by decades of decay, but clearer this time, as if the ship's systems were slowly recalibrating themselves after their long sleep. "Coalition vessel detected. Boarding action detected. Unauthorized access to command systems. Threat assessment. In progress." "It thinks we attacked it," Threll said grimly. "Pulling that data from the core, it must have registered as some kind of intrusion." "Captain, weapon systems are now fully deployed," Pell reported, her voice tight with fear. "I am reading a full activation across the entire ship. Every weapon port I can detect is now armed and ready. Get us out of here, now," Threll ordered. "Full speed, any direction. Just get us away from that ship." "Aye, Captain." The Velkaru's Hand surged forward, its engines burning at maximum capacity, as Pell fought to put as much distance as possible between them and the awakening human warship. On the main screen, the massive derelict continued to grow smaller, its weapon systems bristling now like the quills of some enormous, angry creature. "Doran, keep trying to communicate," Threll said. "Tell it the truth. Tell it about the peace agreement. Tell it anything that might convince it we are not a threat." Doran nodded quickly, already composing another message, his hands moving fast over his console as he tried to find the right words, the right translation, anything that might reach through the confusion of a ship's mind that had been asleep for so long it did not even know the war had ended. "Transmitting now, Captain." They waited again, the seconds stretching out like hours. On the screen, the human warship remained still, its weapons armed and ready, but not yet firing. Perhaps, Threll thought, there was still a chance. Perhaps the ship's automated systems, whatever intelligence guided them, might listen to reason. Then the mechanical voice returned once more, and this time, its words sent a fresh wave of cold fear through everyone on the bridge. "Threat assessment complete. Hostile intent confirmed. Engaging defense protocols." "It does not believe us," Mira said, her voice shaking. "Brace for impact," Threll shouted, gripping the edge of his console as the massive human warship, awakened after decades of silence, began to turn its weapons toward the small, fleeing scavenger vessel. On the main screen, the crew of the Velkaru's Hand watched in horror as bright points of light began to gather along the length of the human ship's weapon barrels, building toward something none of them wanted to experience firsthand. "Pell, evasive maneuvers, now," Threll ordered. "Trying, Captain, but our engines are not built for this kind of speed." The ship's alarms began to blare across the bridge, a harsh, urgent sound that matched the growing panic among the crew. Threll's mind raced, searching for any option, any way out of the situation they had stumbled into. They had come looking for salvage, for an easy profit from a dead ship. Instead, they had woken something ancient and powerful, something that still believed it was fighting a war that had ended decades ago. "Captain, weapons fire detected," Doran shouted. "Multiple projectiles inbound." Threll closed his eyes for just a moment, bracing himself for what was to come. But then, something strange happened. The bright points of light along the human warship's hull, the ones that had been building toward a devastating attack, suddenly shifted their aim. Instead of tracking toward the fleeing Velkaru's Hand, they seemed to be turning toward something else entirely, something out beyond the edge of the sensor range, something that had just appeared on the very edge of the system. "Captain," Pell said, her voice suddenly confused, "the weapons. They are not firing at us. I am reading new contacts. Multiple ships, just entering sensor range. They are coalition military vessels." Threll's eyes snapped open. "What?" "I am reading 4 coalition warships, Captain," Doran confirmed, his own voice filled with shock. "They must have been tracking us, or perhaps they picked up the same power signature we did. They are moving directly toward the human derelict." On the main screen, everyone watched as the human warship's weapons, fully armed and ready, redirected their aim, away from the fleeing scavenger vessel, and toward the newly arrived coalition military ships. The mechanical voice crackled through their comm system once more, its tone somehow carrying a strange sense of grim purpose despite its distorted, decayed quality. "Multiple hostile vessels detected. Engaging primary threat. All hands, hold the line." "It thinks the war is still happening," Threll said slowly, understanding dawning in his mind even as horror gripped his chest. "It sees those coalition warships, and it thinks it is back in the middle of the war. It is about to open fire on them." "Captain, should we warn them?" Mira asked. "Those are coalition ships. If that human warship attacks them, it will be a massacre," Threll finished grimly. "Even damaged, even after decades of dormancy, that ship's weapons look powerful enough to tear apart a small fleet." He stared at the screen, torn between the instinct to flee as far and as fast as possible, and the growing realization that they might be the only ones who understood what was truly happening here. The coalition warships approaching the derelict had no idea that they were sailing directly into the sights of an armed and awakened human warship that still believed itself to be at war. "Pell," Threll said finally, his voice steady despite the fear still coursing through him. "Open a channel to those coalition ships. We need to warn them, right now, before it is too late." Pell's hands moved quickly across her console, opening a wideband channel toward the approaching coalition warships. Channel open, Captain. This is Captain Threll Osu, of the civilian vessel Velkaru's Hand, Threll said quickly, his voice tense but clear. Warning to all Coalition ships approaching this position. The derelict ahead of you is an active human warship. It has fully armed weapon systems and appears to believe it is still at war. Turn back immediately. I repeat, turn back immediately. There was a brief pause before a response came through, a voice sharp with irritation rather than concern. Velkaru's Hand, this is Commander Yeska, of the Coalition patrol cruiser, Iron Resolve. We are aware of the derelict. Scavenger vessels are not authorized to interfere with a Coalition salvage operation. Withdraw from this area immediately. Threll's chest tightened with frustration. Commander, you do not understand. That ship is not a simple derelict anymore. It has active weapons, and it is treating your vessels as hostile targets. If you approach any closer, it will open fire. Another pause, longer this time, before the commander's voice returned, still skeptical, but with a note of doubt creeping in. Explain. We boarded that ship less than an hour ago, Threll said quickly. It was completely dead when we arrived. No power, no life signs. But something we did while aboard triggered its systems to reactivate. It has been broadcasting warnings, and it just tried to fire on us before your ships arrived. Its automated defense systems appear to believe the war with humanity is still ongoing. That is impossible, Yeska said. That ship has been drifting for decades. Even human technology could not maintain functional systems for that long without active maintenance. I do not know how it is possible, Threll said, his patience thinning, despite the danger of the situation. I only know what I have seen with my own eyes. That ship is awake, it is armed, and right now, it is aiming its weapons at your fleet. There was a long silence on the channel. Threll could imagine the scene aboard the Coalition cruiser, officers arguing, sensors being rechecked, doubt and disbelief warring with growing caution. Sensors confirm weapon activation on the target vessel, another voice cut in, presumably one of Yeska's officers. Commander, the scavenger's warning appears to be accurate. I am reading full targeting locks on our formation. All ships, defensive posture, Yeska ordered, his voice suddenly sharp with urgency. Shields to maximum. Prepare for. The commander's words were cut off as the human warship opened fire. On the Velkaru's Hand's main screen, the crew watched in stunned silence as brilliant streaks of energy tore across the space between the derelict and the approaching Coalition fleet. The weapons fired with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for a ship that had been dead just hours earlier. The first strikes hit one of the smaller Coalition escort vessels directly, tearing through its shields as if they were nothing more than a thin veil, and ripping deep gashes into its hull. By the old stars, Mira whispered, watching the destruction unfold. It is really fighting. Commander Yeska, do you require assistance? Threll asked into the comm, though he knew there was little the Velkaru's Hand could actually do against a fully armed human warship. Negative, Yeska snapped back, his voice tight with the strain of directing his ships through sudden, unexpected combat. Withdraw to a safe distance. This is now a military engagement. The Coalition fleet scrambled to respond, their 4 ships breaking formation and attempting evasive maneuvers as the human warship continued its assault. Despite its age, despite the decades of dormancy, the Meridian's vow moved and fought with a terrifying efficiency, its weapon systems tracking and firing with a precision that spoke of technology far beyond anything the Coalition ships carried. Its weapons output is incredible, Doran said, watching his sensors with wide eyes. Captain, based on what I am reading, that ship should not be able to sustain this level of power output, not after decades without maintenance. Something does not add up. Maybe it does not need to make sense, Threll said quietly. Maybe that is exactly what the old stories used to say about humans. They found ways to make the impossible work. On the screen, one of the Coalition warships attempted to close distance with the derelict, likely hoping to overwhelm its defenses with concentrated close-range fire. But the human warship's automated systems anticipated the maneuver, shifting its own position with a burst of thruster fire that should have been impossible given its condition, and unleashing a devastating volley directly into the approaching ship's engine section. The Coalition vessel's engines exploded in a bright flash, sending the ship tumbling out of control, venting atmosphere and debris into the void. They are losing, Mira said, horror creeping into her voice. The Coalition ships are actually losing to a ship that has been dead for decades. Threll watched the battle unfold with a strange mixture of horror and grim understanding. He thought back to the story they had uncovered aboard the derelict, the tale of Captain Elena Voss and her crew, who had given everything to protect a convoy of civilians against overwhelming odds. This was not so different, he realized. The ship's automated systems, whatever intelligence guided them now, were still operating under the same core directive that had driven its crew decades ago. Defend, hold the line, do whatever is necessary. Except now, the ship believed it was defending against an enemy that no longer existed, fighting a war that had ended long ago. And the Coalition ships caught in its crosshairs had no way of explaining that to a machine mind that understood only threat and duty. "Captain, another transmission from the human ship," Doran said suddenly. "It is broadcasting on all channels this time. Put it through." The mechanical voice returned, still fragmented, still carrying the strange, patient quality that had marked all of its previous communications. "All Coalition vessels, withdraw immediately. This position is protected. Convoy escort duty. In progress. Withdrawal is your only warning." It thinks it is still protecting that convoy, Threll realized aloud. Even now, even after everything, it still believes its mission is not finished. "Commander Yeska," Threll said quickly, opening the channel to the Coalition fleet again. "Did you hear that transmission? It is telling you to withdraw. It believes it is still protecting a civilian convoy from decades ago. If your ships pull back, it may stop firing." There was a tense pause before Yeska's voice returned, strained but listening now. "We cannot simply withdraw. That ship is a threat to Coalition space. If it is truly still active, still armed, we cannot allow it to remain here, waiting for the next ship that stumbles into its range. Then you are going to lose more ships trying to destroy it," Threll said bluntly. "I do not know if you noticed, Commander, but it just crippled one of your vessels in a single volley. How many more can you afford to lose?" There was no immediate answer, but Threll could hear tense voices in the background of the channel, officers arguing, options being weighed. Finally, Yeska's voice returned, tighter than before. "What do you suggest, Scavenger?" Threll thought quickly. The ship's systems believe the war is still happening. It does not know the peace agreement was ever signed. If there was some way to make it understand that the conflict ended, that its mission was already successful, that the convoy it was protecting made it to safety decades ago. "You want us to negotiate with a machine that thinks it is still fighting a war 40 years in the past," Yeska said incredulously. "I do not see many other options that do not end with more of your ships destroyed," Threll shot back. Another pause, this one longer, filled with the sound of distant explosions and shouted orders as the battle continued to rage. Finally, Yeska spoke again, his voice grim but resigned. "All ships, cease fire and withdraw to minimum safe distance. Let us see if the Scavenger's idea has any merit before we lose anyone else." The remaining Coalition warships, 3 now instead of 4, began to pull back from the derelict, their weapons falling silent as they retreated to a more cautious distance. On the main screen, the human warship's weapons tracked the retreating ships for a tense moment, but did not fire again, seeming to recognize the withdrawal for what it was. "It is not pursuing," Doran reported, relief evident in his voice. "The Coalition ships are pulling back, and the derelict appears to be holding position." "Small mercy," Threll muttered. "Doran, can we re-establish communication with the derelict? I want to try something." "I can try, Captain, but after everything that just happened, I am not certain it will listen to us any more than it listened before." "We have to try," Threll said. "If we can make it understand that the war is over, that its mission succeeded, maybe it will stand down before anyone else gets hurt." Doran worked quickly, composing a new message and running it through every translation protocol available to them. This time, Threll dictated the words himself, speaking slowly and carefully, hoping that somehow, some fragment of understanding might reach through whatever remained of the ship's damaged systems. "To the automated defense system of the UES Meridian's vow," Threll said. "This is Captain Threll Osu. I know you do not know me, and I know you have no reason to trust me, but I need you to listen. The war between the Coalition and humanity ended over 40 years ago. A peace agreement was signed. Your mission succeeded. The convoy you protected reached safety. All 12 transport ships escaped. Your captain, Elena Voss, and your crew gave their lives so that those people could live. Their sacrifice was not wasted. It worked. The convoy made it. You can stand down now. The war is over. Doran transmitted the message, and the bridge fell into tense silence as they waited for a response. Long seconds stretched into a full minute, then two, with no reply from the derelict warship. Maybe it cannot understand us, Mira said quietly. Maybe its systems are too damaged to process something like that. Or maybe it simply does not believe us, Sask added grimly. Why would a machine built for war trust the word of an alien vessel it has already tried to destroy once today? Threll stared at the screen, watching the massive, scarred hull of the human warship as it hung silently in space, its weapons still deployed but no longer firing. He thought about the skeleton they had found on the bridge, about Captain Voss, who had stayed at her post until the very end. He thought about the log entry Doran had found, the last message left behind. If anyone finds this ship, tell them we held. Try again, Threll said quietly. Tell it about the log entry. Tell it we found the message. Tell it we understand what it did and what it means. Doran nodded and began composing another transmission, but before he could finish, the mechanical voice crackled through their comm system once more, weaker now, as if the effort of processing everything it had just received was straining whatever remained of its damaged systems. Confirm peace agreement, confirm convoy status. It is asking for confirmation, Threll said, hope rising in his chest for the first time since the battle had begun. Doran, send it everything we have. Every record of the peace agreement, every piece of data we can access about the years since the war ended. Show it the truth. Doran worked quickly, pulling every relevant file from the Velkaru's Hands databanks and transmitting them toward the ancient warship. Historical records, news archives, records of trade agreements between human and coalition space, established in the decades since the peace was signed. Everything that might help a confused, damaged machine mind understand that the war it still believed itself to be fighting had ended long ago. The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. On the main screen, the human warship remained still, its weapons deployed but silent, as whatever intelligence guided it processed the flood of information they had just sent. Then, slowly, one by one, the weapon systems along the ship's scarred hull began to retract, sliding back beneath the protective armor plating from which they had emerged. The bright lights that had flickered to life across the derelict's surface dimmed, though they did not go out entirely this time. The mechanical voice returned one final time, quieter now, carrying something that almost sounded like exhaustion, or perhaps, Threll thought, something closer to grief. Confirmed, mission, complete. A long pause. Requesting, survivor status update. Threll felt his chest tighten at those words. The ship was not just asking about the war, it was asking about its own crew. It wanted to know if any of them had survived. Doran, he said quietly, do we have any records, any information about survivors from this ship? Doran was already searching, his hands moving quickly across his console. Give me a moment, Captain. Let me check the old war archives. Doran searched through the old war archives stored in the Velkaru's Hands database, records that had been collected over decades of trade and cautious contact between coalition and human space. It took several minutes of careful searching before he found something useful. Captain, I found a record, he said, an old human historical archive that was shared with coalition scholars during a cultural exchange program about 15 years ago. It mentions a rescue operation near a system called Kello's Drift, dated to the final year of the war. Escape pods from a destroyed human warship were recovered by a passing human patrol several days after a major battle in that region. How many survivors? Threll asked. The record says 23 crew members were recovered alive, Doran said, including several officers. There is a name listed here as the senior surviving officer, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen. Threll let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. Send that information to the ship. All of it. Let it know. Doran worked quickly, compiling the historical record into a transmission and sending it toward the ancient warship. They waited again, the bridge quiet except for the soft hum of the Velkaru's Hands systems and the distant, retreating forms of the coalition fleet, still holding position at a cautious distance. When the mechanical voice returned this time, something in its tone had changed. It was still fragmented, still carrying the strain of decades of damage and disuse. But there was something almost peaceful in the way it spoke now. 23. Survivors. A long pause. Mission, successful. Crew, did not die in vain. No, Threll said softly, though he knew the ship's systems were unlikely to properly understand him. They did not. For a long moment, nothing happened. The derelict warship simply hung in space, its weapons retracted, its lights dim but steady. Then, slowly, new text began to scroll across one of the bridge's secondary screens, as the ship's systems, still limited by decades of damage, found a way to communicate more clearly through written data rather than fragmented speech. Meridian's VOW Automated Defense System. Thank you for this information. Standing down from combat protocols. Entering maintenance mode. Requesting assistance, if available, to contact human authorities regarding this vessel's status and location. Threll read the message twice, making sure he understood it correctly. It wants us to contact human authorities, he said. It wants to go home. Captain. Incoming transmission from Commander Yeska, Pell said. Put it through. Yeska's voice was cautious, but no longer hostile. Velkaru's hand. We are reading the derelict's weapons have fully retracted, and power levels appear to be stabilizing at a lower output. What did you do? We told it the truth, Commander, Threll said. The war is over. Its mission succeeded. Its surviving crew members were found and rescued decades ago. It just needed to know that before it could stand down. There was a long pause on the channel before Yeska spoke again, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been respect, or perhaps simply relief. That is, not the outcome I expected from this operation. We lost one ship and nearly lost more. I do not know what to make of any of this. Commander, Threll said carefully. That ship is requesting contact with human authorities. It wants to report its status and location. Given everything that has happened, given what that ship and its crew did decades ago, I would suggest the Coalition consider handling this situation with some care. This is not simply a piece of salvage. It is a memorial to people who gave their lives to protect innocent civilians, even against a Coalition fleet. Yeska did not respond immediately, but Threll could hear the weight of consideration in the silence that followed. Finally, the commander spoke again, his voice measured and formal. I will pass this information up the chain of command. Given the diplomatic sensitivity involved, this will likely require coordination with human border authorities. Scavenger vessel, I want to commend you for your actions today. Without your warning, and without whatever you did to communicate with that ship, this could have ended far worse for everyone involved. Just doing what seemed right, Commander, Threll said. Indeed. We will take custody of the derelict for now, under careful protocol, until we can arrange proper contact with human space. You and your crew are free to go, though I suspect Coalition Command may want to speak with you about today's events. Understood, Commander. Osu out. The channel closed, and Threll sat back in his chair, letting out a long breath. Around him, the rest of the crew looked equally exhausted, the adrenaline of the encounter slowly beginning to fade, leaving behind a strange mixture of relief and lingering unease. Captain, Mira said quietly, what do you think will happen to it now? The ship, I mean. Threll thought about that for a long moment, looking at the image of the massive, scarred warship still displayed on the main screen. I do not know, he admitted, but I hope, whatever happens, it finds its way home, or at least, that its story gets told properly. A crew like that, a captain who stayed until the very end, protecting people who had no way to protect themselves, that deserves to be remembered. Doran nodded slowly. My father always told me stories about how frightening humans were during the war, how unpredictable, how dangerous. I never once heard a story like this one. I never heard about the ones who stayed behind to save people. Maybe that is the part of the story the Coalition never wanted to tell, Threll said. It is easier to justify a war against an enemy that seems purely dangerous, rather than one that occasionally acts with the kind of courage that puts your own side to shame. The bridge fell into a thoughtful silence, as the Velkaru's hand began its slow journey away from the system, leaving behind the ancient warship and the 3 remaining Coalition vessels, now carefully organizing a proper, respectful approach toward the drifting human ship. Threll watched the image on the screen for a while longer, before finally turning his attention to more practical matters. Pell, set a course for the nearest trade station, he said. I suspect we will have plenty of explaining to do once word of this gets out. Aye, Captain. As the ship turned and began its journey, Threll found his mind returning again and again to the story they had uncovered. Captain Elena Voss, who had given the order to hold the line against overwhelming odds. A crew of 400, most of whom had given their lives so that 12 transport ships full of civilians could escape to safety, and a ship's automated defense system, so faithfully built to honor its final orders, that it had continued to stand guard for over 4 decades, waiting patiently in the dark, ready to defend against a threat that no longer existed. It was not the story of a monster or a dangerous unknown enemy. It was the story of sacrifice, of duty, and of a species that, for all its strangeness and unpredictability, understood something deeply important about protecting those who could not protect themselves. Weeks later, after the Velkaru's hand had been debriefed extensively by Coalition officials, and after news of the encounter had slowly begun to spread through both Coalition and human channels, Threll received an unexpected message. It came through official diplomatic channels, forwarded from human space, carrying a formal seal he did not recognize. He opened it on the bridge, with Doran, Mira, Sask, and Pell all gathered around to see what it contained. The message was simple, but it struck Threll harder than he expected. It was from a woman named Sarah Chen, now elderly, identified as the former lieutenant commander who had survived the battle at Kello's Drift decades earlier. She had been reached by human authorities after the Meridian's Vow's location and status were finally confirmed and reported back to human space. To the crew of the Velkaru's hand, the message began. I do not have the words to properly thank you for what you did. I was 26 years old when I climbed into an escape pod and watched my captain's ship fall behind, still fighting, still buying us time to escape. I have spent 43 years wondering exactly how she died, and whether her sacrifice, and the sacrifice of everyone who stayed behind with her, truly mattered. You have given me an answer I never thought I would receive. Thank you for finding her. Thank you for listening to her ship, and to her crew, and for making sure their story was not forgotten. Captain Voss believed, until her very last moment, that protecting others was worth any cost. I am glad to know that even decades later, in the vastness of space, surrounded by strangers from a species she never lived to meet in peace, that belief was finally understood and honored. Threll read the message twice, then set it aside, looking out at the stars beyond the bridge viewport. Captain, Mira said softly, do you think we did the right thing? Warning the Coalition ships instead of just running? Trying to talk to that ship instead of just leaving it behind? Threll thought about Captain Elena Voss, about the order to hold the line, about a ship that had waited faithfully in the dark for over 4 decades, ready to defend against a war that had long since ended. He thought about the 23 survivors, about Sarah Chen, and the message she had sent, carrying 4 decades of grief and unanswered questions, now finally given some measure of peace. Yes, he said finally, I think we did exactly the right thing. Outside the viewport, the stars continued their slow, endless drift, indifferent to the small dramas of individual lives and ships. But somewhere behind them, in a quiet corner of space between 2 dying stars, a human warship that had once been forgotten was finally being brought home, its story finally told, its crew's sacrifice finally understood by those who had once called them enemies. And across both human and Coalition space, in the months and years that followed, a new kind of story began to spread, one very different from the old tales of unpredictable, dangerous warriors that had once defined how the Coalition understood humanity. It was a story about courage, about sacrifice, and about a captain who held the line until the very end, so that others might live. It was, in the end, a story worth telling. The end.